Hello and welcome to Learning and Development Corner, a video series where we discuss what's working in the L&D field. I'm your host, Emily Touche, and today's guest is Annie Grace, co-founder of the Team Together and Women Facilitating. Annie designs and leads highly participatory offsites, leadership workshops, and strategic sessions that help teams and leaders surface priorities, build buy-in, and find better ways of working together. Her sessions unlock shared ownership, improve how work gets done, and strengthen trusts in times of complexity and change. She also co-leads Women Facilitating, a membership community for women who use facilitation in their work and want to keep growing their skill and confidence while advancing the practice together. I am a founding member, proudly. And you can find Annie at the Team Together, Women Facilitating, and on LinkedIn. All right, now for the interview. Okay, amazing. Hello, Annie. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
All right, so you are a facilitator, and I'd love to just start out by how do you define facilitation?
Yes, obviously it's something that so many people don't quite understand, and there's been I like to think of it as like, the coaching world is something, it's a multi-billion dollar industry. It has accreditations and it has coaching of coaches and this whole world. And so people kind of get it now, right? It's kind of in the zeitgeist. It's the mindset is within organizations. And I think facilitation is kind of on the next precipice because alongside coaching, what we really need is dealing with the groups. So, kind of a simple way that I like to talk about it is it's kind of the craft of creating those conditions that you need groups to participate fully so that they can get meaningful work done.
Mm.
But I think that's a cursory explanation for kind of a multifaceted thing. So, the other elements that I really want to bring up are that I believe that good facilitation involves the design process. It's what happens before you ever get into a group, before you're ever in front of people. And it's about the ability to come up with good objectives, understand how long that might take, trying to prioritize those objectives and work with other people to kind of get to the core of that, right? And then, of course, you have the work of figuring out what are the types of activities, how are you spending that time? What's the sequence of those activities? And then how are you going to land the plane when it's done? So you have kind of the before the process. And then during, you have the relational field that you have to tend to, right? So what are the dynamics that are coming up when you're in front of the group, the power dynamics, who's talking more, who's talking less, and kind of naming some of those unspoken things or gravitating or shifting how you're doing things to kind of create more equity and more participation in the room. And then, of course, it's like helping people connect with each other so that the work can get done.
Mm.
And then there's all of that kind of like being able to improv in the moment. And I always think about it as like, how do you serve the outcomes over the agenda? And then how do you serve the group even over the individual, which is something that is a really tough thing to master. And so I think it's about, really being able to stay present to all of those different dynamics happening at one time. And then lastly, it's about what happens after you facilitate. How are you actually making the habit changes? How are you holding people accountable? If you're doing a learning experience, what are those learners walking away with and how are those learnings sticking? And so it's about how do you close things and what are you doing to follow up with that? So I really see facilitation as a kind of before, during, and after. And then, of course, kind of serving what are the outcomes that you're trying to get towards.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I love that plane metaphor because I really think of you have to design a really good plane and check that everything's working and have a very specific purpose for that plane. What is it going to do? Then there's that adaptation of flying the ship, making sure that everyone's engaging in a way that's helpful to them. And then, yeah, tracking those outcomes and making sure there's that reinforcement because without the tending to the after, things can kind of just fade or not get those outcomes that we want. So that was a great holistic definition. Thank you.
Yes. And I feel like that's like even more true in emergent. There's a bunch of things you can facilitate, right? You can have a strategic meeting, you can have a group that's getting together for group coaching that's working on mental health. You could have a coalition of nonprofit leaders, right? There's so many things that you can cover. And I think what's most interesting is the field of emergent facilitation, which is kind of more about how do we follow what's happening in the room and really like move towards that. And so this idea of like landing the plane is the most important when you're dealing with emergent design and emergent facilitation. And I feel like my business partner have been able to really like hone in on how do you design for that? What are the things you need to do before? What are the things you need to do in the moment to kind of gather and be like, okay, how are we going to land the plane? How are we going to reiterate to the participants in front of us, what have we done? Why did it matter? And then how are we going to close? And landing a plane is that moment where people get hit with this wave of like, wow, we just did a lot. I understand it. I can like sense, make, and analyze. And then when I go home today, it's going to like live on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's the magic.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to name, yeah, so you and Shannon Varco work together at the team together, and that's the partner you're referencing there.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct. Yes.
So I'd love to jump into a story from there. So, this series is really centered on learning and development. And I'd be curious to hear from your experience, where does facilitation fit into learning and development? And could you share a story of a time that facilitation was able to contribute to an organizational learning and development strategy?
Yes, so L&D is, facilitation and L&D really go hand in hand. I think we can also think about it as the kind of before, during, and after. So when I'm talking about before, during, and after the learning experience itself. So I always think about like before the learning. I think there's a lot of ways that people come up with their organizational strategy. Oftentimes it's going to be working with kind of looking at the future demands of a business and trying to understand where the gaps that we don't have within our talent, right? So some of that's going to be in hiring and some of that's going to be developing the people that you already have. I think another approach, which I've seen work really well, so this is part story, part what I think L&D has, is about when you get employees involved in the types of learning experiences that they want to have. And so there's been listening tours, there's been kind of a series of workshops. So you can have workshops of just employees themselves, of kind of asking them, what are they motivated to learn? Where do they see their careers going and the gaps in the market? And then you can also have that with managers as they're having those one-on-one talks with folks and being able to gain insights. They're kind of already seeing into where do these people want to be going and how are we going to help them get there? And I think it's the blending of those things. We often have strategy coming down from on high, and that is important to try to see like what's the big picture. But it's the people on the ground who are trying to figure out where do I need to be learning? What do I need to be learning? We want to understand what they see in the market, where they can kind of see their needs getting met, and where they feel like they can't get those needs met. And most importantly, there's a lot of synchronous learning experiences out there. I'm sorry, asynchronous learning experiences, right? So there's a lot of like LinkedIn learning and a lot of places where you can go to kind of watch videos and be a bit more passive. And so there's a lot of that content out there. And so I think it's about figuring out like where do companies to fill in the gaps that their employees can't get access to. And so that's really where facilitation and the kind of like interactive participation is going to come into play.
Hmm. Yeah.
So then you have the like during the learning experience, and then it's like how do you kind of how do you shift your kind of teaching learning experiences to be way more facilitative? And so I've also like helped L&D practitioners kind of like change. They might have had a lot of kind of async courses and they were like, okay, now what do we do? How do we turn these into something that people are going to be engaged with? A
Hmm.
lot of this was seen during COVID. So I had a lot of clients who were like, what do we do now that we're no longer just this in person? I also saw this for onboarding, right? They might have had like amazing week-long in-person onboarding experiences. And then they're like, oh my gosh, what do we do now that we're not all getting together? And so a lot of that learning is about how do you just make the most highly participatory, engaging online sessions where it's like people are only talking at others for a very short amount of time and they're mostly talking with each other.
Hmm.
So those are some of the best stories that I've seen come out of the L&D space is when they're just like realizing, this is about people talking with, not at each
Hmm.
other. This is like the internal networking that can happen from these sessions.
Hmm.
So I saw a lot of companies kind of pivoting how they were doing L&D so they kind of meet those needs, which turned
Mm.
out well. And then lastly, it's kind of like, okay, after the learning experience, right? You might have, again, most good L&D programs are going to have some synchronous and some asynchronous, but then it's kind of like, okay, how do you make that work? So what we do with the team together is we have follow-on group coaching sessions. Other companies, I've seen continuous learning circles. I've seen masterminds. And again, this is where you're going to be strengthening the internal networks of companies, which is super important. But also it's like things have to be relevant. They have to be, you can learn about how to give and get good feedback, and you may not need that for another like 5 months. And then it comes up, and then the person's like, okay, how do I actually put this into practice in this moment? Because this person is way more difficult than the example that I had when I was in that class 5 months ago. And so it's, we're never just looking for learnings, we're looking for habit changes. And so it's really the after the learning and how do we keep that moving. I find that a lot of people tend to not want to invest in that because it feels expensive and too much. But we've also found that we've been able to train up some of those internal facilitation communities inside. So if you're running masterminds or kind of ongoing coaching, we found that that's how the learning really sticks.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I just want to pull out that phrase that you really emphasized through that story of facilitation as the practice of helping people talk with each other and how essential that is for learning and development initiatives to really to stick and to build organizational capacity centered on what the employees actually need. Yeah.
Yes. And I'll say one other last thing that is kind of something that we do as a team together that I haven't seen a ton of that I would love to see a lot more of, which is actually teams learning skills and developing and learning together.
Mm.
So we see that there's a lot of leadership development cohorts, and I think that those are great. We run those, we see those again for strengthening internal networks. I think that is a completely underrated asset to what that can do within companies and how that can like build a better cross-functional community, which is really important. But then again, you're always pulling people out. They're coming back to their teams. They're having to reinforce all this new language, these new skills. And then there's also builds resentment. So you notice that some people are like, well, why didn't I get picked to go to that amazing cohort? Or my application was denied for that kind of senior management training. And so what we're finding is to have a lot bigger impact is actually the like team learning experiences.
Mm.
So especially for topics like feedback, psych safety, because essentially it's like these are the things that teams are doing together, right? These are the practices they have to be doing. Feedback is not something that can be learned through hearing,
Mm.
right? And it's not even something that can just be learned by practicing with people. It's like actual real feedback and having those conversations. And so being able to do that in a facilitative environment is so much safer and also just like allows people to practice with the tools that they need to be able to actually create different ways of working together.
Yes, yes. Here to more actual team that actually works together, getting to train together. I'm so happy
Yeah.
to hear that y'all are doing that.
Yeah. And we like to say we want to build teams of, instead of leaders of teams,
Yeah.
we want to build teams of leaders.
Yes, 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 yes. Leaderful organizations. Okay. So my last question for you is if an organization wanted to upskill their teams in facilitation, what would be some simple entry points you would suggest?
Yeah, well, Emily, you and I already talked about the importance of meetings and kind of like everyone knows everyone's had a bad meeting. So you kind of have, obviously there's so many different meetings. I always like to start with the biggest impact is dealing with the all hands or all staff. Basically, it's the meetings where you're having the most amount of your employees come. So the simple entry points for that would be more about the design of that meeting and who's running those meetings because it is so expensive. People do not usually think about the expense that they have when they're getting, you know, I've worked on some companies where they have thousands of people coming, right? That's thousands of people there 1 hour and you can that's a real cost for that. And so a lot of people are like, those meetings are fine. They're totally fine, right? But that might be costing you tens of thousands of dollars for totally fine when it can really next level you. It can help your cross-functional issues. It can help, strengthen things and make things clear about like what are other people actually working on? Why does it matter? And so I think some simple entry points for that are just kind of like simple, more interactive, more breakout groups, getting people to actually be talking and kind of shifting away from that presentation talking at kind
Mhm.
of process that a lot of people have. And that's kind of on the, larger picture. And then of course it's just trainings for how to run better virtual. And then of course hybrid meetings. This has been a big area that people really don't understand. And we like to talk about hybrid as being three separate meetings. You have your virtual meeting, you have your in-person meeting, and then you have the place where those two things meet. And so they actually need to be, they're like triple as much work, really. They need to be thought about in completely separate ways. So that's also a totally different kind of skill set. And then I think there's just all of these things come back to just like how to teach people some really interesting participatory moves that they can make, whether they're in an all hands, whether they're in a huddle, or they're in some type of like more strategic meeting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And do you have any specific resources that you lean on for like when you were kind of becoming more versed in participatory group dynamics? Are there any kind of like tools you grab or little prompts or resources or books that have been particularly helpful for you?
Yeah, I always come back to liberating structures because they're just like such a great kind of entry point and they're really made and designed to be expert-less. So, liberating structures are a set of micro facilitation activities and they're just a great way. They're they're open and free for everyone to kind of go and learn. I do definitely recommend talking to people who have run them because there's ways to kind of up level them and use them in different ways. And then I'll also just say, I mean, Brene Brown puts out so much good information. It's definitely for a more seasoned facilitator. I've taken a lot from her structures called the Rumble or a lot of things around her feedback, like how to know. She has great checklists for how do you know you when you're ready for giving feedback. So I'd
Mm.
say she has a lot of really great content. She offers a lot of that also just like online for free through her podcasts. And then lastly, the best podcast that I listen to right now is Change Signal. And it's really about like how change management's happening through different organizations. And that again is not going to be the kind of like simple tools that you can just kind of, but I think it's really more about a mindset that's allowing leaders to kind of make those changes and efforts as they're kind of having all these vast changes that are happening in our market right now.
All right, those are so helpful. I'm really excited to check out those resources, and I've taken your class on liberating structures that has already been really helpful for me in the women facilitating group, which you host. So yeah, that's all the questions that I had for you today, and I'm so glad that you were willing to hop on here and talk about that. Really, like you said, yeah, facilitation and learning and development go so hand in hand, and I think that. Um, I'm just so glad that you were able to be here today and share some of those really helpful insights and wisdom around facilitation with us.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, Emily.
All right. Bye.